it comes together. I'm almost the embodiment of it coming together on the revenue operations focus with loyalty, experience, and then payments activity. And I think the way to best illustrate that is with a stat where a majority, about 76% of churn at any company can be related somehow to a payment experience going bad. Whether it's an inbound payment where it's clunky or you don't support the payment type that I prefer, or it's an outbound payment where the whole customer experience was great right up into the last few feet that people don't think about, which is, hey, I was owed a refund from this company and it took 6 months to come, and then it was a clunky check or some other option that didn't work. We're in the business of payments, but we're in the business of solutions, and the solutions that we bring to the table help things like churn reduction and creating more loyalty by having the payment experience be a real meaningful part of the overall customer experience. So my background with IESP and with the Incentive Marketing Association, I'm involved in those groups as well as the payment side of the business because of how much they really come together, and we're solving problems to help bolster all of that for companies.
Vince Chiofolo, thanks so much for joining me on the RevOps Champions podcast this morning. How are you?
Hey, Brendon, I'm great. It's it's still summer here, although fleeting. I'm hanging on to it. I'm here on the South Shore of Long Island in New York, and hoping to get 1 or 2 more beach days in before the season ends.
Yeah, well, good luck. We typically go up to the Massachusetts next week, but this year the conference that we go to, which is the big HubSpot inbound conference, is going to be in San Francisco instead. But who knows? We might get a beach day in San Francisco.
Can't complain about that.
Right. So Vince, you're the SVP of Revenue Strategy at Dash. As people might see online, it's the full name is Dash Solutions. And you're also president of the IESP, which is the Incentive and Engagement Solutions Providers. And I'd like to sort of touch on those a little bit, which I'm sure it'll unfold as well as we go. But maybe to kick things off, can you just share with us, who is your target customer at Dash?
Yeah, so target customers at Dash, so a little bit of background first of what Dash does, and I like to say I think of Dash as a 30-year-old startup, but in a good way, right? We've got almost 3 decades of experience in managing payment solutions for companies. So any company that makes an outbound payment to a person, whether it's a customer or an employee, like an award, a reward, or an incentive, or it's a partner, we're in the business of making those payments easier and more efficient. And when we do that, I say the startup piece is we're constantly innovating and staying nimble and adjusting to how the payment, culture is changing and how people like to get paid, and we're quick to adapt. And we're making some significant innovations in the markets that we serve. And who those are, again, it's everybody that gets paid, or any company that pays individuals, but there's some concentration where that becomes way more important to do that fast and in a way that's engaging. So in healthcare and in product manufacturing, right, where loyalty is very important, employee loyalty and customer loyalty, of paying things like rebates or credit balance adjustments or refunds really quickly. That's really important. So what I like to say Dash in the business of is we kill the paper check with a much faster and better way to pay. It's also more cost effective. So it helps to bolster those industries in an area that not a lot of people think about. Right, payments are usually inbound or B2B, and we're in the business to person payment, business to consumer or employee. But ultimately, what we create is a smoother experience for the company, the customer, and it's just a really great, powerful combination when you have happier customers and employees with smoother operations to manage it.
Yeah, and it's, I think what's really interesting, as I was sort of thinking about this, and I'll be honest, it's not something I think about a lot, but I think, and for a lot of leaders who think about payments, they don't necessarily put payments with as you say, whether it's of an external vendor or partner, or an employee or some other kind of partner that's more directly involved in the business, they don't often put payments and loyalty and engagement in the same sentence, right? Now, you obviously have a lot of background in sort of loyalty. How did it come together? Your sort of background and belief in loyalty, and how did that connect to what you currently now do as far as how payments work?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, and it comes together. I'm almost the embodiment of it coming together, right? On the revenue operations focus with loyalty, experience, and then payments activity. And I think the way to best illustrate that is with a stat where a majority, about 76% of churn at any company can be related somehow to a payment experience going bad,
Wow.
whether it's an inbound payment where it's clunky or you don't support the payment type that I prefer, or it's an outbound payment where the whole customer experience was great right up into the last few feet that people don't think about, which is, hey, I was owed a refund from this company and it took 6 months to come, and then it was a clunky check or, some other option that didn't work. So really, we're in the business of payments, but we're in the business of solutions, and the solutions that we bring to the table help things like churn reduction and creating more loyalty by having the payment experience be a real meaningful part of the overall customer experience. So,
Yeah.
my background with IESP and with the Incentive Marketing Association, I'm involved in those groups as well as the payment side of the business because of how much they really come together, and we're solving problems to, help bolster all of that for companies.
Yeah. And I guess those are areas where, again, the sort of the customer experience component of that is often for leaders and companies is somewhat of an afterthought, and I'm guessing they typically learn it the hard way, right? Where they, to your point, they provided this great customer experience for months or weeks or whatever. So it was interesting what you were saying about, how, and I think a lot of leaders in business, that they need to learn this the hard way, because I think if you ask any business leader, would you always want to keep improving your customer experience, they would say absolutely, but they don't necessarily always know what that means. And I think, at least from my experience, payments, whatever payment solutions they're using is probably not where they're going to think about first, as far as, what is the weakest link in their customer experience. And it sounds like, Dash, you and the Dash team have created essentially that solution, but they had to learn it the hard way, where they lost customers because, they had a poor experience with whatever the payment was, or they lost employees because of the way that a payment was missed. Is that very much core to what it is that you're solving for?
Yeah, it's definitely a main core, and it's relevant to RevOps, right? Because you've used RevOps in that statement, because everybody's got skin in the game when it comes to churn. You can't delegate something as important as churn in the business to one group. And historically, we've seen, things like churn in business be a finance problem, right? Like, manage the numbers because it's part of it and it's reducing revenues. But solving for churn becomes more of a group exercise where you've got RevOps in the equation to help with the customer experience. You've got marketing in the equation that, often runs the user interfaces and the tools that are managing the payment process. You've got, sales that has skin in the game. So those coming together as more of a coalition, I think helps to drive this identification that churn is a problem where payments can often be the culprit. And then they work together to solve it, right? It could be something in the customer experience. It could be inbound payments where maybe there's not enough options for the customer to choose from to pay, or perhaps they'd
Uh-huh.
prefer to split their payments versus paying all up front. And in that
Right.
way, the solution is mitigating a problem as much as it is creating a new revenue lever and an opportunity, right? Because you could
Uh,
open the TAM for more people that can pay in an easier way, or you can retain a customer longer and turn them into more of an advocate by continuing a great customer experience by paying them a refund in a way that's engaging, that you've invested into to make it, a good experience for them. you start to not only save lost revenue, but you can have opportunities where you start to drive more revenue that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. So to sort of dig a little deeper, what would you say are the most common sort of obstacles or challenges that companies are having when they reach out to Dash or connect with Dash in order to fix those issues?
Yeah, almost all of them have an outbound payment challenge that can be followed to the root cause of cutting checks. And I think we're seeing this everywhere. Even governments are starting to get out of the business of writing checks because it's inefficient and it's costly. And if a government's come to that conclusion, businesses should definitely be coming to that conclusion as well. So
Hmm.
whenever a company has to pay an individual, cutting a check means there's the cost of the check. And I think a lot of folks don't realize how much cost there is to cut a business check because it goes through so much
Hmm.
processing, but it can be
Right.
over $16 every time you cut a check, even if it's for a buck. Face
Hmm.
value doesn't matter, right? So there's obvious costs. Then there's back of house costs, right? You have to have finance teams administrate those checks. There's a sheetment cost of labor and time. If you have a lost and
Hmm.
stolen check, you've got to replace that check. So there's just all this management of paying these outbound payments that you have to push out. So where they come to Dash is like, we want to get out of this business, right? We want a better method to be able to pay faster and in a way that's more efficient. But at the same time, we don't want to have to manage all of this. We want it to be more automated. We want to trust a team to manage this so that, the people at our business can focus on things that are more core to their experience. And so, that's where we come in and we put solutions in the name of Dash because that's really what we're doing. We're not selling a commoditized product, for everybody. It's not about a prepaid card or a digital payment. We're creating advanced integrations. We're creating solutions that surround those payments to solve real
Hmm.
problems that businesses are having that there aren't a lot of folks out there solving.
Yeah, really interesting. So you mentioned integrations. So what are the most common integrations that you have? So when a customer decides, okay, we want to incorporate Dash solutions into our tech stack and into our complete payment solution, what are the most common integrations that you do or have?
Yeah, those integrations could be literal, right? So we work with a lot of other platforms where they're technically in the business of paying out on behalf of their clients. So for that, think of, like a restaurant software where, part of the restaurant workforce management suite involves paying rewards and incentives and things like that to employees or customers of a restaurant, or the same in agriculture or others. And so we can integrate with platforms that help to make it so you don't have to just come to a Dash portal to manage a payment, right? It lives within the suite of a tool you're already using today. Um,
Okay.
there's literal and technical integrations, but then there's also just integrating within the workflow of the customer, right? Being able to kind of adhere to the motions and the rhythms of how they operate instead of creating a whole new one, where Dash comes in and works with their teams to be able to, perhaps it's just using our tools, but in a way that works for them and adheres to the groove of how they already work today. So we like to bind ourselves to the customers and make it a natural fit so that we're solving a problem in a really smooth way.
Hmm. So, and because it is very much sort of person focused and often employee focused, does it? I mean, does it integrate with like an HR type, with HR platforms or CRM
Oh yeah.
platforms? Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so many different use cases of how companies pay individuals, right? But in the pay card use case, right? So folks, a surprising amount of folks in the US at least are unbanked or underbanked, right? So, they don't have a bank account that they use, so they don't get an ACH, payment, or they get a paycheck, then they have to figure out how to cash it. Right. So what we offer is a pay card where they're paid on the card and they get their wages and they could spend that card and then take cash from the ATM. And so that's an example that involves an integration with a workforce management solution, right, or an HR
Hmm.
tool that runs payroll. So instead of, hey, I'm going to manage payroll over here, but then also over here with Dash, right, the two talk to each other, where it's, we give our employees the option to choose either getting paid by ACH, a paycheck, or a Dash card. And as the administrator, if it's a Dash card, they're just pushing those funds to the Dash side, right, through the same portal that they use to manage payroll for the other sides. Right.
Hmm.
So, there's a whole suite of technical integrations, and we've got a great team behind it to be able to do, as I said, just have Dash live within the tools and the workflows that you have today, rather than adding another layer onto, the stack that you're managing in your environment.
Yeah, just not just adding more complexity. Um, and then Vince, so what are the roles that you work with most closely in within an organization?
Yeah, so kind of like we said before, payments, everybody's got skin in the game, right? So when it comes to paying out use cases of businesses paying individuals for rewards or incentives to employees, the decision lives in the HR, right? That's an initiative that they may have, where it's, hey, we want to do a
Hmm.
SPIF program for our sales team, or we want to do an employee recognition program for our employees. Others will be involved in that decision by committee, but they're really leading that charge in HR. If it's more disbursements to pay things like refunds in a better way, credit balance adjustments, and just more like core payments, typically lives in finance, and then has operational roles around it. So, it kind of depends on the use case, but it's very much finance is involved in every decision. And then more and more there's ops and then revenue operations involved. Just because, like we've said before, it's adding into existing workflows and processes in the business. So to do that in the best way, it's not just financial exercise and HR exercise, it's operational in nature.
Yeah. So could you sort of dig into that a little more? Like, so an example of how it works in the sort of the RevOps space. Um, yeah, maybe just do you have any examples you could share?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on the industry, but at a company like a large manufacturer, right? If their pain is when we get either overpaid by employees, or we owe funds back, or there's a recall, we got to pay funds out to individuals. Their challenge and the organization operationally is paying out those funds. So again, you have finance that they are obligated to pay these funds out. But operationally, they have to go out in an efficient way that adheres to the systems and processes that involve revenue. And, I've been
Hmm.
in RevOps, now for about, 10 years. I mean, since they've been using the term. And what I've seen
Hmm.
is a real progression of revenue operations was really managing this outbound tool stack. And now it's starting to become more and more just operations in nature, but very central to revenue, right? So if funds are coming in, like making sales, like, yes, that's a centerpiece of the tool stack. But more and more RevOps is getting involved, as they should, with other areas that involve the flow of revenue, and sometimes that's outbound, right? So getting
Hmm.
involved at those product manufacturers of, hey, we're going to sabotage loyalty if we don't have a really great engaging way to pay. You're perhaps in finance running the initiative, but we're going to come in and make sure that it works within our systems, that people are getting paid well, that it's integrated well, that it's working, and we're not going to create those poor payment experiences, again, half of which affect overall consumer experience and lead to churn. So again, as more just general operators that are involved in business health, great revenue operations people are starting to just get involved in these projects, and it's helping them in the long term reduce churn of revenue and then create new revenue levers and more opportunity for businesses.
Mm. Yeah, that's actually really interesting, and I would say we're seeing the same thing. So when we started getting involved, and then of course calling it RevOps, let's say seven years ago, even so we were working with marketing ops, we were working with sales ops, we were working with service ops, and so it just made sense, the whole RevOps model, where there's just more alignment across the revenue team, just made so much sense to us. But we've actually seen this organic, and I'm sure we're not the only ones,
Mhm.
this organic shift, that alignment is now happening with what we refer to as kind of the back office,
Yeah.
where to your point, I think it's just operational efficiency, period.
Yeah.
And there's even just from a RevOps perspective, from the very beginning, one of the sort of the hidden sort of values and benefits of this alignment of the revenue team, so across marketing, sales, and service, was a vastly improved customer experience.
Yeah.
And I think as business leaders have seen that improvement in customer experience, they were like, well, what if we can continue to bring that same sort of strategy and philosophy completely cross-functionally through the business? It will improve the customer experience from end to end. So that's a really interesting point of view.
Yeah, I mean, revenue is everywhere, and as it's highly pervasive in the business, so is RevOps. So if you have a team that is leaning into sales ops, marketing ops, customer success ops, financial ops, that's a big bulk of the whole business, right? So you're kind of RevOps that's everywhere, just helping to lift the tides of operations across the whole business. And because revenue is so pervasive, it all comes back to helping revenue, and that's the gig.
Yes. Yeah. So we started talking a little bit now about alignment, right? So and ultimately from a strategic leadership perspective, that is really core to a lot of the things that we're talking about. So how do you think about alignment, whether it's from a pure revenue focused RevOps perspective, or kind of what we've started talking about now, whereas you have this complete sort of ops function that where one of the biggest values to businesses is actually the alignment piece of it. How do you think about an alignment from the highest sort of viewpoint in the business and the benefits of that?
Yeah. I think of alignment as a huge opportunity, but also a huge threat, right? For a difference between getting it right and getting it wrong. Because disjointedness in a company can really be public enemy number one when it comes to growth and trying to scale. And I think there's studies that actually support that. I remember a McKinsey study that suggested that 64% of executives, so 2/3 of execs, say that organizational silos are the number one barrier when it comes to scaling growth at their companies. And the reason why is when growth starts to really accelerate at especially growth stage companies, there's this natural tendency for teams to run faster, as they should, but they run faster in their own lanes. And then that's where misalignment starts to creep into the business and result in different departments chasing their own strategies with their own rules, their own metrics that they're following. So it's important to operate from this shared set of truths and outcomes throughout a business. So, really 3 factors. It comes down to metrics, operating rhythms, and good communication. Right. So metrics, the visibility of metrics at a practical level, that could mean, one unified scorecard for the whole organization where functions like marketing, sales, and customer success are all measured under similar, in some cases, the same factors, right? Where they all have some investment in, like pipeline creation, conversion, retention, expansion, and all those that are involved can be tracking the same shared, visibility, but also accountability on the results. And then you have rhythms, right? And that means building consistent and shared operational moments or movements throughout the business so that everyone is really playing the same tempo. So that could be joint forecasting, right? That doesn't just involve sales forecasting, but other, areas of the organization, cross-functional pipeline visibility and deal reviews. So everybody sees the meaningful deals that are coming, shared planning or strategy sessions. Like these are all things where people can see how their individual piece in the business impacts the larger picture of what the business is looking to do. And then needless to say, like the last thing that brings it all together is just communication, right? So communication has to scale as the business scales. And small companies have this way of communicating verbally, right? Because you communicate in meetings because you have all the information, all the people, and it's very close. But with scale, that starts to come apart because there's more things to communicate, there's more people to communicate to. And if you try to do that the same way, you find yourself in meetings all day with, no time to actually do all of the things that you're coming up with in those meetings. So the
Mm-hmm.
ways of communicating valuable information needs to change. So when you bring all three of those things together, you really have, value in a trifecta of scale fundamentals that creates a strong engine for clean and scalable growth.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. So metrics, rhythms, and communication.
That's it.
Um, I mean, it's yeah. I mean, if I think about all the different business operating systems and models out there, I think they all say some version of that, right? Like, for example, a lot of, I mean, I would say maybe 70 to 75% of our clients run on some sort of business operating system like EOS, you might be familiar with, where again, they talk about those things as so in EOS, for example, there's the 6 components, but those 6 components would include these 3 things.
Exactly. Sure.
So if we sort of dig into the metrics for a second, so from your perspective, like what are examples of metrics that actually do tie an entire organization together? In other words, whether you're in sales, marketing, service, operations, HR, finance, like what are 1 or 2 metrics that everyone can sort of get behind because it makes sense?
Yeah. Well, we just talked a little bit about churn. So I think looking at retention and net revenue retention is something every single group should care about. Of course, not just finance and not even just sales, but everybody is in their own way affecting the customer experience, and customer experience drives whether the customer is going to stay or not, or whether they're going to grow or not. So I think
Mm-hmm.
looking at, the numbers and seeing how that's going broadly, right? What's our
Yeah.
net revenue retention, but also kind of looking at key customers and their health metrics, right? Everybody has some involvement and should in making sure that customers are satisfied and those numbers are looking good, and then ideas to spawn more ability to retain customers and grow existing customers. Because when you can grow your existing customers in addition to just retain them, that takes pressure off new business development and constantly having to find new logos. So,
Mm-hmm.
retention and then customer growth are two real big ones. And then
Mm-hmm.
getting into new logos, just sales and business development, right? So everybody at the organization, even though they may not be salespeople, they should all think like salespeople and think like marketers, and try to find opportunities to create new connectivity and find new channels to leverage to try to find more customers, and rethink of what the ICP is. Are we chasing the right customers? Are there new pockets of market that we should be considering? And all those great conversations happen when you start to look at metrics, right? When numbers are great, how do we keep this going? When numbers are not so great, can we find new opportunities? So, it becomes a North Star for organizations when you start to take those big metrics that involve revenue, and you start to bring in all these different teams, and then everyone thinks in terms of revenue. And that's good for everybody and good for the customer, and everybody wins.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really, really insightful. So the metric that's been coming up quite a bit recently here on the RevOps Champions podcast, half the time because I'm the one that's bringing it up, is LTV, so lifetime value, right? Which is typically then followed at some point by CAC, so the cost to acquire a customer. And how so and I think NRR, you just mentioned, net revenue retention as another metric, which a lot of people are less familiar with, but it seems to be gaining a lot of traction. Do you have any thoughts on the connection between net revenue retention and LTV? And you started talking about like growing existing customers, which then of course reduces your cost of acquisition because you already have them as a customer. How do you think about LTV through the lens of how you just talked about all the other metrics that you just talked about?
Yeah, I mean it's really important, and I think there's a finite amount of levers that you can pull to try to rise LTV, or lifetime value of the customer, right? So you can increase your revenue, right? Try to find new things to sell, right? That's always the endeavor, and that's hard, but I think folks underestimate the value of retention, right? So if let's look at the opposite of value, right? The risk of retention. If your monthly churn rate is 5%, you're wiping out almost half the business annually, right? So then you have to make it up and not only
Mm.
become even, but then you have to find new logos to get growth. So, you know, just going out and raising costs or finding new things to sell, that's a lever. But the focus on loyalty that drives retention and gets people to stay is what helps to really rise LTV in a meaningful way. And so, the lifetime value of the customer involves the amount of dollars, which we're talking about now, but it also it involves the lifespan, right? So the time of the customer. So come back to this
Yeah.
concept of loyalty and experience. If the customer is happy, they're spending more, they're not churning, and those things are great for dollars, but length is also very impactful for dollars. So a customer that stays 5 years instead of 3 years is going to be incredibly impactful for the business. And if they stay longer, now you have a flywheel effect of growth that you may not have had otherwise. So it's right that you bring up LTV in these episodes, because investors more and more are looking at LTV and what you're doing to make sure that it's strong, and what LTV is relative to your customer acquisition costs, and is that balance healthy? Because if unit economics are good, then the whole business is good. So costs to value of the customer, are positive, and it's not just the dollars the customer is paying; it's how long they're staying, how happy they are, how much they're growing.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because when you if you even if you just forget about everything that we just talked about and all the acronyms we just mentioned as far as metrics were concerned, if you just think, by the way, I try and sort of dumb it down for, if you were trying to explain this to a 12-year-old or whatever, it really comes down to value creation, right? So, and yeah, because if you're continuously creating value, and you just gave a perfect example of what drives LTV that a lot of leaders might not think about enough, is if you keep a customer for 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years instead of 1, 2, or 3, I mean that is, first of all, it's a much higher lifetime value, but also your cost of customer acquisition is going to be a lot less, because you've already got them as a customer. So you're not putting as much pressure and much cost into your sales and marketing.
That's
But
right.
it really comes down to value creation, right?
That's right. Yeah, and literal value creation. Like we brought up investors, and there was a study recently that I saw where a 1 to 2% drop in annual churn in an ongoing business like a SaaS business can increase that company's valuation by 12% over 5 years. So just 1%, just drop churn 1%, and that's a meaningful valuation boost that you get from the investor community that would take forever, right, to chase new logos and a lot of investment. But you invest the time and the resources into just a little bit of a change, to help boost retention, and you get a big payoff over time.
Yeah. So Vince, why do you think it is that more leaders don't think about the expansion of existing customers, and they far rather just spend money on acquiring new customers? That still seems to be, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, that still seems to be, there seems to be a disproportionate amount of energy being spent on net new logos or customer, whatever you call it in your business, instead of the growth of existing customers. Why do you think that is?
I think it's cultural, right? It's business culture, right? Which tells the folks that should have the hand in focusing a lot on retention and churn reduction to go focus on chasing new logos. And I think
Right.
part of what creates the culture and the tempo is, the investor community. So new logos for a long time and top line revenue was really valuable. And, people are going to follow that pace to try to create the new logos and get the great race car names on their website and try to get top line growth, right? So as they do that, that mind share is invested into one area and it takes away from the other, right? So if you're all
Mm,
in on new business growth, it almost it seems like you're taking it away by focusing on the I'll call it less cachet centric, retention area. It
mm,
makes headlines when you win a big customer, but nobody's really publishing headlines about someone retaining a great customer. So it's a little bit of the culture and the cachet, but I really think the pendulum's starting to swing a little bit. And again, it's influenced by the investor community, like we said, care a lot about NRR today, and
mhm.
people are following suit. They're thinking more about loyalty. They're coming to Dash to try to enhance the payment experience to be able to retain customers longer and get that better LTV. So I do see it starting to change, but it's cultural, where this lives in finance and it's one person's area, and now it's spreading through an organization and starting to take on a new form of committee and focus on LTV to grow, and not just literal traditional growth to grow. The best is both.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Because I mean, I think the way you connected that to culture was really important, because I was just thinking about, if when there's a friend of mine that whenever I see him, he'll say it at least once, keep the one thing, keep the main thing, the main thing. So if the culture is, that the main thing is net new logos, then that's going to be the culture. And so people aren't paying as much attention. And to your earlier point of, like, you have people across the entire organization, from marketing to finance, where they're going to be looking at what that North Star is. And if that North Star seems to be, whether it's explicit or just implied, they're going to be like, oh, okay, we just need to support, net new logos, and they're not going to be thinking about,
That's right.
retention.
Yeah, it's where,
Interesting.
the question to start a meeting might be, hey, we've got a revenue problem. How are we going to grow quickly? Um, Everybody's mindset shifts to going and chasing new markets and spending new money and doing new campaigns, where more and more, I think now we're starting to see people focus on new customers, retaining them, but also upsell opportunities. All right. There's so much opportunity to add more value to existing customers, right? Your next best customers or your existing customers, try to find new ways you can help them and add value and then earn revenue as well. And it's just being more part of the conversation as CS infuses further with sales to create one revenue engine.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this cultural thing that you talked about now. So we work with a lot of franchises, and typically sort of larger franchises, and but of course we also we talk to people across the franchise industry, and one of the big sort of obstacles in the franchise industry, or is this mindset in the franchise development space, which who are the people who need to bring on new franchisees. They're always chasing and trying to sign up a franchisee to take more than one unit or location, right? Um, Instead of just getting them on board, having them be successful with that one unit, and then they will grow organically. Because if they're being successful with one unit, it's pretty obvious they're going to add a second and a third and a
You wouldn't
fourth.
even have to ask, right? It just invites them to want to lean in further.
Right. Which I think is another interesting way to think about how this all works. Very cool. Okay, so then what about the communication piece? I mean, how do you? So I mean, we've started touching a little bit, because obviously communication is again, you will not achieve the culture that you want in any organization without the communication. Is there anything that you'd like to sort of add? And I know I skipped the rhythms piece, because I think the rhythms is, of course, is your weekly or quarterly meetings. It is, again, talking about these metrics and why they're important. It's also part of the communication. But is there anything else on the communication piece that you think might be low hanging fruit that a lot of leaders are missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's a really broad statement. It's just really important in communications to stick to the fundamentals, right? There's just so much that can be communicated, that the most important things to prioritize are core to the strategy of what you're trying to do, whether it's the company's overall strategy or it's that quarterly strategy, right? How does what you're communicating fit in? Because it's easy to get paralyzed, right, with so
Hmm.
many things that need to be dispersed throughout an organization. And it's hard to distill it, but staying grounded really is like, what's the core strategy of what we said we were going to do, and how does what do people need to know to be able to help to foster that strategy. Because you can't communicate everything, so if you can distill it, stick to those impactful pieces that help people play their part.
Hmm.
A lot of it has to do with problem solving, right? It's not just, hey, let's communicate information, you listen in. A lot of it is, hey, we've got a market problem or we've got a product problem. And a bit that I like to talk about relative to communication and problem solving is the mantra of a problem well stated is half solved. Right. So when thinking about how to communicate, and when there's challenges, come in and really make sure you're communicating the problem well and not just saying what the problem is, because the tendency is
Hmm.
then to jump into solutioning without having a really full understanding of what the challenges are and what the problems are. And there's a quote that I'll align to that from Einstein. He said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. And I
Yeah.
think that's a great lesson for people to keep in mind in business, is really communicate well the challenges or objectives before jumping into the answers, because the answers will organically flow, right? Once you have a real well-defined, well-stated problem or objective of what you're looking to do, with the right people in the room to hear that message.
Yeah, that's a really good message, actually. In fact, as you were saying that, I was thinking, if I could go back to my younger self and start making a list of like recommendations, I would have told myself in my 20s. One of them actually would have been exactly that, which is, and again, I just learned about it recently, but I wish I'd known this 30 years ago, which is, if focus on the problem, and focus more on the problem and less on the solution. Because I think, to your Einstein example, if you really understand the problem or the problems, then creating the solution is so much easier.
That's the easy part. That's right.
Yeah, and then actually, I guess it's somewhat related to a famous past American president who said, if someone gives you 8 hours to chop down a tree, spend the first 7 hours sharpening the axe, kind of thing,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
I probably messed that up, but something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Very
close
similar.
enough. That makes sense.
Yeah. So Vince, as we begin to wrap up here, I can tell that you have many other things that you'd like to share, and obviously we'll make sure we include links for people to follow you in the show notes when this episode comes out in a couple of weeks. But is there maybe one thing that you wanted to make sure you sort of left our listeners with, as far as advice? Because I mean, you have a front row seat, through the IESP, in how loyalty drives business. And I think, if you think about everything we've spoken about, and how we're sort of wrapping this all up, it's around what are the things you can do to retain customers in a business. So what advice do you have for the folks listening, and of course to me?
Yeah, I think, loyalty involves a few different pillars, and a lot of people tend to think of it as a monolith of emotional loyalty, right? Run ads and tap into emotions, and that's important, but loyalty has to have structure. Otherwise, it very easily comes apart at the seams. Um,
Hmm.
so, emotional loyalty with customers is great, but I also talk about aligning that with the concepts of behavioral loyalty and structural loyalty, right? So ensure that you're not just creating love with the customers, because customers love a lot of companies that, it just doesn't last. Right? Blockbuster being one of them, and Radio Shack, and all these companies that we love and we think about and romanticize, but they're gone because there wasn't structure or behavioral habit loops that kept people hooked in. So
Hmm.
emotional loyalty is important. Structural loyalty, if emotional loyalty is the heart, structural loyalty is the hooks. Make it hard for people to leave, where you're just like the default option.
Mm-hmm.
And then behavioral loyalty is the habit, right? Like make sure that you're part of everybody's every day. And Blockbuster is a great example because it was right. The culture of people were, hey, when I'm done with work on a Friday night, I go to Blockbuster and I shop around for a movie and I take it home. And that was part of a habit loop. But as the consumer market changed, people don't want to go out, right? They want to stay home. They want it to be easy, fast,
Mm-hmm.
And so, the adaptation of behaviors, or the way that the behavioral habit loops work in that company, would have made a little bit of a difference. So I think, as people start to think about how can I retain customers, keep them for the long journey, right? Think about how to emotionally connect with them. Think about how to structure it in so it's hard for them to leave, not trapping them in, but making yourself a no-brainer to stay. And
Yeah.
then, really adhering to the way that their day is conducted, right? Habit loop
Uh,
formation, make it seamless and simple. And if you have all three of those things, you don't really have to work very hard to get them to stay. They're just going to want to stay, right? And then you can focus your time on how to grow them and how to sell more things that provide value. So loyalty has a ton of value and a ton of return. And it's good to see more companies focusing and investing more into that.
yeah, I really like that. In fact, as you were saying that, I was thinking about how, so one of the biggest challenges, so in the space that we're in, where, in order to do the RevOps services that we provide effectively for our clients, of course, the first thing that the client needs to do is to set up a CRM. And CRM, if 15, 20 years ago, was essentially seen by, whether it was CEOs or sales leaders, as kind of this prospecting tool. But if you actually think about what CRM stands for, it's customer relationship management, and it's really talking about all the things that we've just been talking about. It's like, how do you manage all these behaviors through structure to improve, and you're always improving value creation, but you have to be tracking it all somewhere, which
Right.
is the structure. So I really like um, how you made that connection for me. So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
So Vince, I wish we could continue, but I know we're out of time, and you probably have places to go. So thank you so much for joining me today, and hopefully we can have you back another time and dig further into value creation as businesses continue to navigate the changing landscape of technology.
Yeah, I would love to. And I love the podcast and appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, Vince.
Thanks, Brendon.